So I'm Margaret Marshman. I'm from, is my microphone on? It's green. Yes, Yep, okay. I'm from University of the Sunshine Coast, so about an hour and a half, 2 hours north of here. And I'm looking at the tensions that have motivated two experienced mathematicians to move from the mathematics department to the maths education department. So I'd like to begin too by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and acknowledge their continuing connection to the land, water and culture. And I recognise that these have always been places of sharing and gaining knowledge, and that we're continuing on in that tradition through this conference. And so there is much to learn from that. And I pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and any Indigenous people in the room as well. So I'll talk a little bit about the problem. I'll give some literature, talk about my research design, and then some findings, discussion and conclusion. So I'm at the moment working in the education department. I used to teach mathematics, but now I'm in the education department. And our secondary pre-service mathematics teachers, generally in Australia and in a lot of places in the world, are taught mathematics in the maths department and how to teach maths in the education department. And those pre-service teachers talk about the conflicting practices due to the differing, what they perceive as the differing beliefs of their teachers in the mathematics department and their teachers in the education department. And usually they don't see the value of the advanced mathematics courses they have to do. They don't understand why they have to do it, and they don't see the connections between a lot of the mathematics they learn at university and what they need to teach in the school. So that has been like a real area of interest for me, because my passion really is trying to improve the quality of teaching in schools. And so what we've got are these boundaries between the two departments. And I'm coming at it from that sociocultural perspective. And so we've got that discontinuity between the departments. So the literature talks about, and particularly Wasserman's work, but there's been a little bit of work in this space more recently about the 4 types of connections that can be made between school level mathematics and advanced mathematics. Because really, if they're going to come to university and study mathematics, we want them to see the value. So we've got those content connections, those concepts that are taught at higher level, but they're teaching it perhaps at a bit lower level. But so we want them to understand it. And for them to have what we know within education as that horizon knowledge, to know where that mathematics in school is going to, is really valuable for their future students. So that we can tell, those teachers can tell students where mathematics can take them. And it helps them to see why they should be studying mathematics at school. So some of those disciplinary connections, those mathematical processes and ways of thinking. So how do mathematicians work? When we use mathematics, how do we use it? Like, what are our habits of mind, our practices, a lot of that excitement that mathematicians have. So how do we help our students see it? There are those classroom teaching connections. And there's actually quite a bit of a disjuncture between how mathematics is taught in schools and how it's taught at universities. So schools everywhere are really big on, for example, graphics calculators, but they're not used at university. Some of those inquiry-based approaches, but also those designing problems. So when you give students a problem, why do you give them that problem? because often you're doing it for a very definite reason, because you want them to see the structure and the connections so that when they go into their classrooms, they can design problems where all the mathematics can come out of one or two problems, so they can see those connections. So the two research questions I'm going to talk about are, what are the tensions that these two motivated, experienced mathematicians to move from the mathematics department to the education department, and what is the mathematics that they believe that these pre-service teachers need to be taught? So I used Valsiner's zone theory, which is an extension of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. So that zone of proximal development, your background and your teaching. The zone of free movement is that which is allowed in your environment. So the type of students you're working with, the structural characteristics of teacher education programs, those university organisational structures, and the culture. And then you've got the zone of promoted action, where what is promoted? What activities or resources can maths teacher educators use to improve their teaching practice? So, for example, reflection on practice, research with teachers, professional development, attending conferences, and some of those informal discussions. So this is a multiple case study, and it's part of a larger study. So I've been interviewing and surveying Australian maths teacher educators using, there was a survey sent out to all schools or departments of mathematics and education in Australia. I only got 30 survey responses, but anyway. And then the last question on the survey was, would they be willing to be interviewed? And I've interviewed 10 people on that. So when they did complete the survey, they were often willing to engage in an interview as well. And so these are just two people that have come out of that. I was not quite expecting these results, though I probably should have if I thought about it. I've used gender-neutral pseudonyms specifically, and I used Valsiner's zone theory to analyse it. So I looked at their zone of proximal development, their zone of free movement, and their zone of promoted action in their past, their present, and their future. So I set up the spreadsheet with the zones across the top, and then past, present, and future down the side. So this is Ashley. Oh, it's not showing. So she was, in the past, they were a professor of mathematics. They'd been 20 years in the mathematics department, and they were teaching content courses to pre-service teachers. But the tension that they talked about was, I'm teaching these pre-service teachers content, but they're not remembering it. That they were starting to shift for me towards that idea of understanding that habits of minds and working as a mathematician, I would say, was just as important skill as acquiring the content knowledge. So they were starting to realise within their teaching that when they were using problems with their students and encouraging them to work like mathematicians. So within schools from prep, we have students thinking about working as a mathematician. So obviously their definition of working as a mathematician is much less than your definitions, but they talk about working mathematically and talk about working as a mathematician as young as prep. So they started to realise that that was important, and that prompted them to apply for a position of Professor of Maths Education and Dean of the School of Education. Well, probably had more titles, but I called it education so that it's not so obvious of the university. And so presently, they're helping teachers to acquire that sense of what mathematics actually is. So these are all quotes. They began a maths and a master of teaching, and in there they learnt that idea that pedagogical content knowledge was not something that had occurred to them before. So pedagogical content knowledge is that knowledge between that understanding of how to teach and the understanding of doing mathematics. How do you teach mathematics in a way that helps your learner to learn it? So what are some of the potential misconceptions they can have? What can you do to avoid those misconceptions? How can you help them to develop the understanding, but to use a task that's going to bring around the different ideas? And if you look, like I was talking to Tanya Evans at Tamsin Meany, her poster in the lunch area. There's some nice example of that. She's got that one task that had 3 components and how it can develop lots of different ways of looking at a variable just from the one task design. And then they've said, when I was a mathematician, there was certainly a perception that people who left mathematics were leaving mathematics because they weren't good enough for it, rather than moving to maths teaching because that's what they wanted to do. So they had a bit of an identity crisis before they accepted that position, because they had this feeling that mathematics was somehow superior to education. But then they decided that that's what they wanted to do, and they now co-teach curriculum courses. So how to teach mathematics. And their possible future is that I've acquired a unique combination of perspectives, and I actually have something to contribute. Oops, wrong way. And the other person was also a professor of mathematics, but they admitted that they were always a very teaching-focused mathematician, and they, in their career, completed a Master of Education really quite early with the idea of building their teaching experience. So that's not the one that gives you lets you go and teach in schools. It's the education more broadly. And what the tension for them was that a one-size-fits-all thing didn't fit with what initial teacher education students needed, and they wanted that to be different. And they couldn't do it where they were working, so they went and completed a graduate diploma of education, qualified as a maths teacher, and then a position came up as a professor of mathematics education and dean of education in their university. And then they talked about, one was that they started to think about the way they taught people and what they were actually knew or not, and whether that mattered. And they talked about how they avoid, as much as possible, explicit approaches. They want different ways of experience mathematics, problem and project-based learning approaches, technology-enhanced sort of approaches using Desmos or GeoGebra to explore ideas and develop understanding of concepts. And they're teaching mathematics content and mathematics curriculum because their university has gone to where they've now got teach mathematics for pre-service teachers within their school of education. And in their possible future, they think about practicing mathematics as a mathematician. You actually really do value real understanding of mathematics, and you value conceptual understanding. So the tension that Ashley and Jordan were feeling was concerned that pre-service teachers were not remembering the mathematics that they were being taught, and that they needed more than content knowledge, and that one size that fits all that happens with service teaching is not suiting the pre-service teachers. And then they thought they really needed to experience mathematics as it was practiced. So Ashley created hybrid practices, and that included teaching mathematics as it's practiced for primary pre-service teachers, including the disciplinary connections and the habits of mind, whereas Jordan was using pedagogies of mathematics educators to teach the mathematics content and pedagogy and the modelled instruction connections. And then through the project and problem-based pedagogies, they teach mathematics as it's practiced. So doing those disciplinary connections, and that the cultural differences between departments can cause angst. So I realised it's only a small study, so you can't generalise, but the fact that these people were professors of mathematics and then moved to professors of maths education means that there is quite a bit of significance in the finding, and suggests that perhaps mathematicians could support pre-service teachers to consider how the mathematics they learn at university can be applied in their future teaching practice, and think about some of the potential connections that you can make. Thank you. So, any questions? Yes?
About 15 years ago in the United States, was a mathematical educator teachers course, which came out. One of their recommendations was precisely there should be a capstone course for secondary PhDs that would be precisely this: connect the advanced mathematics they've learned as undergraduates with the mathematics. So we worked very hard to make that course. And then the second edition of the course, no, actually, you shouldn't do that. You should diffuse these connections throughout everything that they do. We still have the capstone course, and I think it's been effective and popular, and I'm just wondering if such a thing exists anywhere else.
I don't know. I mean, at one stage, up until a few years ago, I was actually teaching the third year applied mathematics course at our university. And our university is a bit different because by the time you get into the maths major, 90% of the students are education students. So it's not typical of other universities. So I could make some of those connections. Like I co-taught it with one of the mathematicians, but we sort of made that link. So looked at modelling and problem solving, which was very much part of the Queensland school curriculum. We sort of was developing the mathematics through some of those real life contexts that happened in schools. We were doing much more modelling and using technology more, and a lot of collaboration. So like they do at Melbourne, we had them up at whiteboards all around the room, solving collaboratively, talking about it. I mean, one of the assessment tasks was to discuss how they'd solved the mathematics problem, arguing that if there were engineers or mathematicians in there, they actually needed to be able to communicate mathematics at a conference or to a multidisciplinary research group. And then they had to read a journal article and interpret the mathematics in that. So we gave them a few Nature articles to choose where there were some issues in the mathematics, like some assumptions had been made. So just to get them to do that critical thinking. But I then had to stop teaching it.
First of all, thank you for a really stimulating talk. I have to say that I live this tension every day of my working life. So I put the PhD going on to work as an education focused.
Yeah.
And I think it's really great that you're taking this head on, actually, because I don't believe there's much of this direct conversation, certainly in my circles, about attention.
Mm.
And it's very important, I believe, that the rise of these education focused positions in universities, the increasing influence of those in those positions. I think it's really important to have this explicit discussion.
Yeah.
So I'm actually really grateful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
But I do have a question.
Yes.
It's really about the student perspective, and so in my teaching, I'm aware that I've just finished teaching a third-year honours course, and you know, I think something with the imposter syndrome is part of that. That's my anxiety. I don't think that the students are aware at my journey.
Yes. Yes.
It's definitely there, and I think it kind of relates to what Bill presented. You know, but you know, second time I taught it, and I am getting to my question. I'm aware that students at that level want to have a teacher who is credible and want to have a teacher who's authoritative with respect to material. But I also want a teacher who you know, has a foot in the education space and really cares about what they're teaching and really wants to communicate as clearly you know, and effectively as possible. So anyway, that's all a very long way of asking. So I guess maybe your views on the students' perspective. What they
I think students want to see a bit more of an understanding between the two groups. And they talk about, so I actually had earlier interviewed like 35 pre-service teachers. I mean, surveyed and interviewed. I surveyed, I think, 35 students, like at 3 universities. So out of a potential 600 students, I got 35. And then I interviewed, I think, 6 students volunteered. And they all talked about this tension. And the problem is that they spend at university, and they talk about it when I'm teaching them how to teach maths. They talk about, so we go over to the maths department and some of them just say, this is how it is. You know, you'll do it this way. And we've got someone in our university who said, this is how you'll do it and you will do it my way. And if you don't set it out my way, then it's wrong. And then, you know, we come to you and it's a different way. And they do tend to like it because I do put a bit of history, I do put a bit of real life. And let's face it, most kids in school don't want to be doing maths. So we've got to do something to change it.
I wonder, thank you, Margaret, for the tool. And I'm going to make it easier, I'm going to make it harder. But I wonder whether there is also this, like, how do we address the mismatch between mathematics and mathematicians and school mathematics? And are we preparing the future teachers to teach school mathematics, or are we preparing them to teach something that we recognize as being genuinely mathematical? Because the two are not the same.
They're not the same, but we have to work at school mathematics, textbook mathematics has an issue, but there are teachers out there doing inquiry and doing some great stuff. There are also some that are doing really explicit instruction. But I think if we don't try, like as maths educators, if we don't try and change it, then why will people want to do mathematics? And if they don't want to do it in schools, then they're not going to want to go to university, and there'll be those students that say, just tell me the answer.
But I also feel that we are preparing people who are going to be novices in those environments that already are set up in a particular way. And whether they survive in those environments or not depends a lot on how well they are able to adapt initially what they're expected to do.
Yeah, and I do actually spend a lot of time talking about beliefs and how to cope in that environment. So coming out of, you know, this bigger research, I do spend a lot of time talking about beliefs and your identity and how How would you navigate it when people are saying one thing that you don't agree with, but your value system is here? And getting them to think about it. Like, I can't give them the answers, but I encourage them to think about it before they get out there. But perhaps we'll leave it for the